There is a unique and primal fear that settles in the heart when you are alone in the wilderness at night. It's a feeling that has been shared by our ancestors for millennia, a quiet dread that hums just beneath the surface of the silent, watching trees. The modern world, with its noise and light, has done much to mute this ancient instinct. We pack our high-tech gear, our GPS devices, and our false sense of security, believing we have conquered the wild. But the wild is never truly conquered. It merely waits. It waits for the sun to dip below the horizon, for the campfire to shrink to glowing embers, and for the familiar sounds of civilization to fade into an unnerving stillness. It's in that profound quiet that the other sounds begin to emerge. A snapping twig just beyond the firelight. A rustle in the undergrowth that seems just a little too deliberate. A faint whisper on the wind that sounds almost human. Tonight, we journey into that darkness. We explore the story of an individual who ventured into the great outdoors, seeking peace, solitude, or adventure, only to find something else waiting for them. Something ancient, something hungry, and something utterly terrifying. These are not just campfire tales. They are harrowing accounts of what happens when the thin veil between our world and the abyss of the unknown is torn away in the heart of the woods. Our story takes us deep into the vast, untamed wilderness of northern Ontario, a land of sprawling boreal forests, countless cold water lakes, and a silence that can feel both serene and deeply unsettling. It was here that a man named Marcus, an experienced solo backpacker, sought to escape the relentless pace of city life. Marcus was not a novice. He had spent years honing his survival skills. He understood the woods. He could read the weather in the clouds, identify animal tracks with a single glance, and navigate by the stars as easily as he could a city map. He respected the wilderness, but he did not fear it. Not in the way he soon would. His destination was a remote trail known to locals by an old, unsettling name, the Wendigo Trail. It snaked through a particularly dense and ancient part of the forest, a place largely untouched by logging or development. The name was a relic of the region's native Algonquian tribes, a whispered warning from a forgotten time. The Wendigo, a malevolent, cannibalistic spirit, was said to roam these very woods, an embodiment of winter, starvation, and insatiable hunger. Marcus, a man of logic and reason, dismissed these as fascinating but archaic folklore. For him, the trail was simply a challenge, a chance to truly test his skills against the raw power of nature. He packed his gear, planned his route meticulously, and set off in the crisp air of late autumn, just as the trees were shedding the last of their fiery leaves. The first 2 days were idyllic. The forest was a cathedral of pine and birch, the air clean and sharp. The solitude was exactly what he had craved. His only companions were the chattering squirrels, the distant cry of a loon across a glassy lake, and the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the fallen leaves. He felt competent, alive, and utterly alone. It was on the third afternoon that the first discordant note was struck. While filtering water by a slow-moving creek, Marcus felt a sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. The ambient noise of the forest, the birds, the insects, the rustling of small animals ceased. It did not fade. It stopped, as if a switch had been flipped. An immense, heavy silence pressed in on him. He stood up slowly, scanning the dense tree line. Nothing. No movement. No sound. The feeling was palpable, the kind of stillness that precedes a predator's strike. His instincts, honed over years in the wild, screamed that he was being watched. He remained frozen for what felt like an eternity, his hand resting on the handle of the large knife sheathed at his belt. Just as quickly as it had begun, the silence broke. A single bird chirped, then another, and soon the forest symphony resumed its normal rhythm. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his heart hammering against his ribs. He shook his head, attributing the strange moment to a trick of the mind. the product of too much solitude. But the feeling lingered. That evening, as he set up his camp, the sense of being an unwelcome intruder intensified. He built his fire larger than usual, the crackling flames pushing back a darkness that now felt menacing. As he ate his dehydrated meal, he found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, peering into the impenetrable blackness between the trees. Later, zipped tightly into his sleeping bag, he lay awake, listening. He tried to catalog the sounds of the night, to place them into neat, rational boxes. The hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf pack, the gentle sigh of the wind through the high branches. But then there was another sound. It was faint at first, carried on that same wind. A high-pitched, thin whistle. It was unlike any animal call he knew. It was long, drawn out, and had a strangely mournful quality. He told himself it was just the wind, playing tricks as it moved through a hollow log or a strangely shaped rock formation. Yet, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the sound was intentional. He eventually drifted into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake in the pre-dawn gloom. Everything was still. His fire was long dead, but something was wrong. His camp was disturbed. It wasn't the work of a bear. His food bag, hung high in a tree, was untouched. His tent wasn't ripped. The changes were small, subtle, and deeply unnerving. A single smooth stone had been placed on the log he used as a seat. A line had been drawn in the dirt, perfectly encircling his tent. The small pile of firewood he had gathered for the morning was gone, vanished without a trace. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of his composure. An animal would have ransacked his camp for food. A human prankster was impossibly unlikely this deep in the wilderness. This was something else. This was a message. He packed his gear with frantic, clumsy hands, his eyes darting nervously towards the woods. He abandoned his planned route, deciding to head directly south, back toward the trailhead and the safety of his car. He didn't run, knowing that to do so in the wilderness was to invite disaster, but his pace was urgent, relentless. All day, the feeling of being watched was a physical weight on his shoulders. He didn't stop for lunch, chewing on a protein bar as he walked. The forest, which had seemed so beautiful and majestic just days before, now felt like a cage. The ancient trees were no longer pillars of a cathedral, but the bars of a prison, and he could feel the unseen warden tracking his every move. He pushed himself to his physical limit, hiking until the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the trail. He had to make camp. To continue in the dark was suicide. He chose a small, exposed clearing, hoping the lack of cover would offer some small illusion of safety. As he struggled to start a fire with trembling hands, he heard the sound again, the high-pitched whistle. This time, it was closer, and it had changed. It was no longer just a mournful cry on the wind. Now, it had a cadence, a rhythm that was disturbingly familiar. It was mimicking the melody of the tune he had been humming to himself that morning to keep his spirits up. The imitation was imperfect, warped and slightly off-key, like a recording played backward. The blood drained from his face. An animal cannot mimic a tune. The wind cannot replicate a melody. This was an intelligence. A cold, alien intelligence that was not just watching him, but toying with him. The folklore he had so easily dismissed flooded his mind, the Wendigo, the spirit of the lonely places, a creature known to imitate human voices to lure its victims into the darkness. He scrambled into his tent, leaving the half-built fire behind. He zipped it shut and huddled in the center, clutching his knife so tightly his knuckles turned white. The whistling continued, circling his camp. Sometimes it was far away. Then moments later, it would sound as if it were right outside the thin nylon wall of his tent. Then, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. He held his breath, straining his ears, listening for any sound, any indication of what was out there. And then he heard it, a new sound, a voice. It was a dry, rasping whisper, like the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. And it spoke a single word, a word Marcus had muttered under his breath in frustration not an hour earlier when he'd dropped his flint. Lost. The voice was a perfect imitation of his own, a chilling, flawless mimicry that echoed not only his sound, but his quiet desperation. It was no longer just out there in the woods. It knew him. It had been listening, studying, and now it was starting to speak, using his own voice against him from the suffocating darkness, just inches away. Time seemed to freeze inside the tent. Every rational thought Marcus possessed evaporated, replaced by a singular, paralyzing wave of pure terror. That one whispered word, lost, spoken in his own voice, had shattered his reality. It was a violation of the deepest kind, an auditory invasion that suggested the thing outside knew not just his location, but the state of his mind. He remained utterly motionless, a statue carved from fear. His breath hitched in his throat, and the rhythmic thumping of his own heart was a deafening drum in the suffocating silence. He was no longer a seasoned survivalist. He was prey, cornered in a flimsy den of nylon and aluminum poles, waiting for the predator to make its move. And then, a new sound began. It was the slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy being dragged through the dirt and leaves. It circled the tent, a deliberate, patient perimeter check. Scrape, pause. Scrape, pause. With each scrape, Marcus's mind painted a horrifying picture. A gnarled claw, a misshapen limb, something unnatural and wrong being pulled through the forest floor. The whisper came again, this time from a different direction, right behind his head. It was another word he had thought to himself earlier in the day, a silent prayer born of desperation. Home. The mimicry was flawless, a perfect echo of his own mental voice. How? How could it know his thoughts? The question was a new dimension of horror. This creature wasn't just a hunter. It was a parasite of the mind. Suddenly, the dragging stopped directly in front of the tent's thin, zippered door. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, as if not seeing would somehow make him invisible. He heard a soft, wet sniffing sound, the sound of a large animal exploring a new scent. It was followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath him. Then, a finger, or what he could only imagine was a long, bony finger tapped lightly on the nylon fabric. Tap, tap. A playful, curious gesture that was 1,000 times more terrifying than a violent slash. It was an intelligent probing, a chilling announcement that the barrier between them was insignificant. He flinched back so violently, he hit the rear pole of the tent, the structure shuddering around him. The tapping stopped. A moment of silence stretched into an eternity. Marcus braced himself for the shriek of tearing fabric, for the final violent intrusion. Instead, a deep, resonant hum began. It was a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once, a bass frequency that resonated deep within his bones. The hum grew in intensity, making his teeth ache and his vision swim. It felt ancient, malevolent, the sound of the earth itself groaning in agony. And woven within the hum were whispers, fragments of his own thoughts from the past few days, all spoken in that perfect, horrifying imitation of his own voice. Cold. Just a little further. What was that? Alone. It was a torment designed to break his mind, to unspool his sanity thread by thread. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the humming was inside him, a physical presence in his skull. He curled into a tight ball, his body trembling uncontrollably, and he began to weep silent, hot tears of absolute despair. He was going to die here, in this remote patch of woods, driven mad by a creature from a forgotten nightmare. The night crawled by with excruciating slowness. The psychological assault continued for hours. The humming would fade, only to be replaced by the whistling. The whistling would stop and the dragging sound would begin again. It was a relentless, calculated symphony of terror. Marcus lost all track of time, adrift in a sea of fear. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken him, because his next moment of awareness was of a subtle shift in the light. The suffocating blackness inside the tent had softened to a dim, murky gray. Dawn. The sounds from outside were gone. The only noise was the frantic pounding of his own heart. For a long time, he didn't move. He listened, straining for any hint of the creature's presence. There was nothing. Only the gentle whisper of the morning breeze and the first tentative chirps of awakening birds. Had it been a dream? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion and solitude? He knew it wasn't. The terror was too real, its residue clinging to him like a shroud. Slowly, painfully, he uncurled his stiff limbs. His hand, still clutching the knife, was numb. With a surge of desperate resolve, he decided he had to leave. Now, to stay another minute was to invite the return of that thing with the coming night. His movements were clumsy, amplified in the morning stillness. The sound of the tent zipper being pulled down was like a gunshot, and he flinched, expecting an immediate response. Nothing. He poked his head out, his eyes wide, scanning the clearing in the pale light. It was empty. The clearing was exactly as he'd left it, save for one horrifying detail. His campfire, which he had failed to light, had been built. But it was not built for warmth. In the center of the cold fire pit, his belongings were arranged in a bizarre, deliberate pattern. His metal cup, his small cooking pot, his spare compass, all placed in a neat circle. And in the very center of that circle was the small, leather-bound journal he kept, the one he had filled with his private thoughts and observations about the trail. It was laid open, and on the blank page, drawn in what looked like mud and ash, was a single stark symbol, a crude stick figure of a man, with elongated limbs and a gaping, screaming mouth. At its feet was another, smaller figure, lying on its back. Marcus felt a fresh wave of nausea. It had been in his pack. It had gone through his things while he cowered just feet away. It had seen his private writings. It had left him a message, an obscene piece of art depicting hunger and its victim. That was the final breaking point. Logic, reason, and survival training were incinerated by a primal, all-consuming need to flee. He didn't pack. He didn't gather his supplies. He scrambled out of the tent, leaving everything behind: his shelter, his food, his tools. He took only the knife in his hand and the clothes on his back. He turned south and ran. It wasn't a jog. It was a blind, panic-fueled sprint through the dense undergrowth. Branches whipped at his face, tearing at his skin and clothes. Roots snagged his feet, sending him sprawling into the dirt. But he would scramble up, gasping for air, and run again. He didn't follow the trail. The trail was where it toyed with him. His only thought was to put as much distance as possible between himself and that clearing. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs were screaming in protest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through his system. He felt hunted, pursued by an ancient evil that could mimic his voice and read his thoughts. The forest was no longer a neutral place. It was the creature's domain, and every shadow held a new terror. Hours later, delirious with exhaustion and dehydration, he stumbled into a shallow, fast-moving river. The shock of the cold water was a brief, clarifying slap. He drank greedily, then waded downstream, remembering a fragment of a survival lesson. Running water masks your scent, confuses your trail. He didn't know if such rules applied to a creature like the Wendigo, but it was the only piece of strategy his terrified mind could cling to. For the rest of the day, he followed the water, stumbling over slick rocks, falling, getting up, and pushing onward, driven by a terror more potent than any physical pain. Marcus was found 2 days later by a pair of fishermen near a logging road, miles from the Wendigo Trail. He was suffering from severe exposure, dehydration, and was covered in cuts and bruises. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the damage to his psyche. He was rambling, incoherent, his eyes wide with a permanent, haunted look. He spoke in whispers about a voice in the woods that stole his own, about a whistling that mimicked his songs, about a tall, gaunt shadow that moved between the trees just at the edge of his vision. He refused to sleep, and when he did, he would awaken with guttural screams. The official report listed his ordeal as a psychotic break induced by the stresses of solo hiking. His abandoned gear was never recovered. The local authorities warned other hikers away from the trail for a season, but soon, the story of the panicked backpacker faded, becoming just another cautionary tale. But Marcus's story is not an isolated incident. The wilderness holds many secrets, and not all of them are content to remain hidden. If you reach to the end of our story, don't forget to subscribe if you are not subscribed already. And hit the like button and comment down below where are you watching my story from and what time of the day it is. And check other videos on the channel or playlist for more stories to keep you awake.